to talk about something that came up in an interview that I gave a couple of months back for the Indie Fantasy Club channel on YouTube. There's a link down below in the description to the interview segment where I appear. I had a lot of fun with this, by the way. It was a great time. I got to talk about two of the books that I've released, a couple of stuff that I've got coming out, and I shared my viewpoint on a lot of things, my process and my ideas about things. And one of the questions that I got asked was about the way that my career in writing about information technology has affected the way that I do my work, my choice of subject matter, or my exact working process, things like that. And I realized this isn't something that I've talked about a great deal, because I think one of the easy things for people to think is, okay, I write about computers all day, I write about programming, I write about information technology, therefore I'm going to be writing science fiction. And by the extension of that, I'm going to be writing about science fiction that primarily revolves around things like IT or programming or things of that nature. And the truth is that I actually don't do this to any significant degree at all. To the degree that I touch on any of these things in the work that I create, whether the subject matter or whether because it's just something that's incidental to the story, or whether it's a fixture in the plot or what have you, to the degree that I do that, I don't do it in a way that is really about that. Because when I started writing for fun, just to see what would happen, it was primarily a way for me to take all of the things that I did in my day job and sort of set them aside and say, okay, what else is there here? Because while I find all of that stuff fascinating, and I've managed to parlay that fascination into a career, I find it fascinating in ways that I tend to reserve for writing about as part of my work. And I don't tend to find them fascinating in a way that really drives other parts of my imagination. And I think one of the reasons I felt that way for a long time is because I've been surrounded with so many, I guess, negative examples of how taking those kinds of subjects and turning them into fiction, whether science fiction or more conventional fiction, can be done. And I found most of them, honestly, to be pretty bad, or at the very least to be the kind of thing that I just don't want to read. Classic example of how this played out, I actually told someone that I knew, a friend of a relative, about my day job, and then also about the fact that I wrote SF and fantasy on the side. I said, "Oh, so you write techno-thrillers?" And I said, "Actually, no, I don't." And I think that kind of shocked him a little bit, and because he thought that I was basically doing stuff in what could, for lack of a better word, what could be called the Michael Crichton vein. And while I liked some of Michael Crichton's individual works, I'm not someone that wants to pattern myself after what he's doing. I don't want anything that I do to be identified with that mode, just because I feel like there's so much more else that I could be doing. Michael Crichton was Michael Crichton. He did his thing. He did it very well. And there are many other people who are following in that path in one form or another. And I say, best of luck to them. That's not what I want to be doing. I thought very hard about this, about what I wanted to be doing, what would be best for me and for my particular worldview, and that wasn't really part of it. So one of the ways that I tried not to let this derail me was by thinking about, okay, well, what lessons can I take away from the stuff that I'm writing about that's not just going to make everything become a techno-thriller? The closest thing that I've ever done that could be described as a techno-thriller is a book I did a few years ago called Always Outnumbered, Never Outgunned, because there are elements in it that are essentially about human self-augmentation by way of technology, but there's a lot of other stuff on top of that that's pure fantasy. The human augmentation bit is a complementary part to it. And that particular subplot in the book probably has the most stuff that I've taken most directly from the experiences I've had through my career and the things that I've seen in my field of work. There is also some stuff coming up in a future book, two future books actually, Charisma and Pavilion 7. And they will also draw on some of the same things. But the way all of these things draw on what I've explored in my career, what I've seen through work, they don't tend to be about the most obvious parts of that. Like, I found that what really interests me is not necessarily technology itself, not necessarily, a programming language, but things like the sociological implications of doing things a certain way, like the fact that the vast majority of programming languages are some analog of English because of the universal prevalence of English as the language of scientific communication and so forth. Or other aspects of the way things work, like the fact that every few years there's another hype bubble where something is sold to us as being the truly transformative technology that will change everything. It turns out not to be. People invest, people get disappointed, people go broke, and then after the smoke clears, we find that there are in fact uses for this thing, but they aren't really what we thought they were. And so things settle down a little bit and people actually find what's truly useful there instead of just what's being oversold. Well, meanwhile, all of the really truly transformative stuff is just sort of popping out of the woodwork at random by people who are just saying, what's this do? Insights like that and things that are not really about the tech itself, but what it means to us, what it does to us on a bigger level, how we change ourselves in response to it. I think those are the bigger things that I find myself drawn to talking about. There's a future work that I have planned, which is the way that I've pitched this. Please don't get sick to your stomach when you hear this pitch. This may sound like the grossest pitch ever, but believe me, there's a reason for it. The way I described it was Oppenheimer meets Lord of the Rings. This was my pitch to people who were just basically coming in cold, who didn't know me. I wanted to give them something quick to latch onto. But the basic idea is that I wanted to look at the prevalence of magic in a fantasy world as having some of the same social impact as the creation of an atomic weapons. And also parallels to the rise of the personal computing revolution. When personal computing came along, it was one of those things that was so new and just so untested and untried and strange in a lot of ways that people didn't at first really know what to do with it. There was this bafflement. Why would anybody need a personal computer? What was there to do with it? And then over the course of the late 70s and through the 80s and beyond, we started to get more and more of a sense of what this thing could do, of how liberating it could be, how empowering it could be. And I thought there are parallels there to be made with what the introduction of magic would be like in a pre-modern world that hadn't previously had such a thing, or that had only had it in the most confined ways, that hadn't had it democratized in the way that we have had technologies of one kind or another democratized for good or ill. And I got really excited about that. And I said, yeah, that's the kind of story I'd like to write. I don't necessarily want to make it about the magic system. I don't necessarily want to make it about the nuts and bolts of how the magic system works in that world and how there are parallels between that and, say, how a computer is programmed or something along those lines. And I'm not saying those things wouldn't appear in such a story. They could very well appear in such a story, but they wouldn't be the reason I wrote it. They wouldn't be the main thing that would get me excited about it. They would be nice little bonuses. They would, like the way somebody else described it. They would be like the toy that you get at the bottom of the cereal box. They're not the cereal itself. So the more I thought about it, and the more I said to myself, I don't want to do these things because I'm trying to take the things that were in my line of work and just funnel them one-to-one into a story that I'm writing, because I don't find that fulfilling. I don't really find it that interesting. I think it's much more interesting to go one or even two levels deeper, or to pull back one or two levels and to see how these things represent different things for us, how they represent something bigger for us. The creation of the World Wide Web happened more or less by accident, and it thoroughly transformed our lives. And the implications of having something like that, I think, are far more interesting to me than just the mere nitty gritty. What kind of people does it make us into, I guess, is the best way that I could put it. And one of the things that I've said before is that I've always been fascinated by stories that are about what I call the interstice, where you have the end of one way of life and the beginning of another, and you have people who are jumping the gap between those two things. You have a certain small number of people who, for whatever reason, are uniquely equipped to leap from one precipice to the other. And that's something that I think has become something like an obsession of mine, to tell that kind of story where people are jumping across that gap. So to the extent that I'm writing about, tech and, the pushing of the envelope, I guess it's also a reflection of the way we have people who are living out at that bleeding edge and trying to figure out how to get to whatever other shore there is. Right now I don't need to tell you just how much upheaval we're all going through because of technology, and because of the fact that we don't even use technology anymore. This is a thing that I actually got from the filmmaker Godfrey Reggio, the man who made the film Koyaanisqatsi, which I really should make a separate video about. The way he put it was that we do not use technology so much as we live technology. That our lives are not dictated by nature anymore, but by the technological envelope that we have built for ourselves and which we are entirely enclosed in and which we really don't have an alternative to. And his point was not that this is de facto bad. His point was not that this is something we should do away with, but that it's something we should be conscious of. And that to the extent that we are not conscious of it, we are living in what is essentially a religious state. We take it for granted. We don't see it for what it really is. Questions like that and insights like that to me are far, far more interesting, far more provocative for the development of a story than simply a what if. What if we had a computer that could read minds? Okay, that's a nice place to start. But what is it, once you lay that on the table, if you're not really thinking about what kind of people are going to be the end result of such a thing, what kind of lives they're going to have, and all the rest of that, then you're not really doing that story any service. So the more I thought about it after that interview, the more I said, this whole business of not necessarily trying to take my work experience and funnel it directly into my fiction, this has shaped me a lot more than I thought, and in ways that are both reactionary in the sense that I'm very consciously not trying to write about what I do for a living, and constructive in the sense that I'm taking what I do for a living and I'm trying to find the larger interpretation of it, the less obvious interpretation of it, the less obvious significances of it, and make that into the substance of a good story. And I think, as hard as that is, it's the far more rewarding thing to do. It's the far more challenging thing to do. It gives me much more interesting boundaries to push against and to try and make a successful claim on. So that was my thought after that interview, and I hope to go back again at some point and do another interview with that channel, because it was a wonderful, wonderful thing to do, and it got me to crystallize a lot of things that I had really only taken for granted and not really put into words up until that point. And it always amazes me about how much of that I have waiting to be crystallized, made into words, and given to people like you for both of us to chew on. So that's it for now. Until next time, stay curious.